Daniel Whitfield wired $412,000 to save his mother-in-law's house from foreclosure, and he didn't tell his wife until it was already done. 3 weeks later, at her sister's wedding, Melissa looked him dead in the eye, in front of 40 relatives, and said, "You're an embarrassment to this family." To this day, Daniel isn't sure if she meant the money or the way he'd spent it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why Melissa said those words, and it is not the reason you think. This is not a story about money. It is a story about what money was hiding, and about a marriage that nearly didn't survive one act of generosity. Daniel Whitfield believed he was rescuing a family. He had no idea he was walking straight into the middle of a secret 9 years in the making, a secret that had already shaped every quiet argument, every closed door, every tense silence at family dinners for nearly a decade. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Daniel Whitfield was before any of this began. He grew up outside Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist who worked double shifts to keep the lights on, and a mother who cleaned houses on weekends to cover whatever the paycheck couldn't. Daniel learned early that love, in his family, looked like showing up and fixing things. There were no long conversations about feelings in that house, only actions, only the quiet proof of care that came from a repaired roof or a paid bill left on the counter without a word. By his early 30s, Daniel had built an electrical contracting business from a single van into a company with 14 employees, and everyone who knew him described him the same way, the guy who fixes things, for clients, for neighbors, for family. He took pride in being useful, in being the person people called when something broke, whether that something was a circuit board or a relationship. It was the only language of love he had ever been taught, and for most of his life, it had served him well. 9 years ago, Daniel married Melissa Carter, and from the outside their life looked stable, even enviable. Friends called them a good match, steady, hard-working, the kind of couple who showed up for every birthday party and never missed a Sunday dinner. What people didn't see was the quiet tension that lived underneath every conversation about money in that household, a tension so familiar to Melissa that she barely noticed it anymore, the way a person stops noticing the hum of a refrigerator that has been running their entire life. Melissa had grown up watching her mother, Carol, struggle alone after her father walked out when Melissa was 12 years old. He left without warning, without explanation, taking a company car and half the family's savings, and disappearing into a life none of them were ever fully told about. Carol never spoke badly of him in front of the girls, but the silence itself became its own kind of wound. Money, in Melissa's world, was never just money. It was old grief wearing a new face, and she had spent her whole adult life trying not to look at it directly. Carol Carter, Melissa's mother, was 68 years old, widowed a second time after a brief remarriage that ended in her husband's passing, and proud in the particular way that people become proud when they've had to survive on very little for a very long time. She had raised 2 daughters mostly on her own, working as a school administrator for over 30 years, and the small house she lived in on Maple Hollow Road was the one constant in a life that had otherwise been defined by loss and rebuilding. 6 weeks before her younger daughter's wedding, Carol received a foreclosure notice on that same house, the house where every holiday, every birthday, every family photograph had been taken for over 3 decades. A medical scare the year before, a cardiac episode that had required surgery and months of recovery, had drained what little savings she had left, and now the bank was threatening to take the one thing that had never left her, the one place that still held every version of the family she had built. Daniel found out almost by accident. He overheard a tense phone call between Melissa and her mother one evening while he was in the next room, a call that ended abruptly, with Melissa's voice tight and clipped in a way he rarely heard from her. He asked questions afterward. She deflected, saying it was nothing, just some paperwork her mother needed help sorting through. He asked again a few days later, gently, the way he asked about everything in their marriage, and all Melissa said was, "You don't understand my mom. You don't understand what that house means." Daniel let it go that night, but he did not stop thinking about it. Somewhere in the days that followed, A decision began to take shape in Daniel's mind, quietly, without a single word to his wife. He made a few calls of his own, spoke to a contact at the county recorder's office, and confirmed what he had already suspected, that Carol's house was genuinely at risk of foreclosure within the month. Daniel had spent his entire career solving problems with his hands and his savings account, and this felt, to him, like exactly the kind of problem he knew how to fix. Daniel decided he would pay off Carol's mortgage himself, in full, as a surprise during the wedding week, when the whole family would be gathered together in one place. He imagined the moment clearly, Carol in tears, Melissa proud of him, the extended family finally seeing him not as the outsider who married into their close-knit circle, but as someone who truly belonged. He believed, with complete sincerity, that he was about to become the hero of this family's story, the man who showed up when it mattered most, exactly the way his own father had taught him to. He told no one, not even his wife, because he wanted it to be a gift too large for words, something that would speak louder than any conversation ever could. Looking back, Daniel would later admit that some part of him also wanted to prove something, to himself as much as to Melissa's family, that he was not just the quiet contractor who had married into money and status he hadn't been born with, but a man capable of the kind of grand, decisive love that gets talked about for years. Late one night, alone at his laptop long after Melissa had gone to sleep, Daniel wired $412,000 to clear Carol's mortgage entirely, covering the remaining balance, along with the penalties and fees that had accumulated during months of missed payments. He sat back afterward, smiling to himself in the dark of his home office, already picturing the look on everyone's face when they found out, the toast someone would raise, the way Carol would hug him the way she had on his wedding day 9 years earlier. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that Melissa had already told her mother no, weeks earlier, in a conversation Daniel never heard, standing in Carol's kitchen with the foreclosure notice between them on the table. Melissa had insisted that she alone would handle her mother's situation, in her own time, in her own way, and for reasons she had never shared with her husband, reasons that reached back further than the mortgage itself, further than the marriage, further than most of Daniel's own life with this family. The bank called Carol first to confirm the payoff, a routine courtesy call to verify the wire had cleared, and instead of relief, Carol felt something closer to panic rising in her chest. She called Melissa immediately, her voice shaking, and asked her daughter why she hadn't stopped him, why she had let this happen after everything they had discussed. Melissa had no answer, because she hadn't known either. She hung up the phone and sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive home. For the first time, a crack appeared in a story Daniel thought was simple. Carol did not want her house saved this way, not by him, not like this, and neither Daniel nor Melissa's extended family yet understood why that mattered so much to her, why a woman on the edge of losing her home would feel something other than gratitude toward the man who had just saved it, seemingly out of pure generosity and love. At the wedding reception, held at a restored barn venue just outside Columbus, surrounded by candlelight and family he had known for nearly a decade, Daniel quietly told a few relatives what he had done, expecting warmth, expecting gratitude, expecting to finally feel like he belonged completely to this family that had always been slightly, politely, at arm's length from him. Instead, the news moved through the room faster than he could control, table to table, whisper to whisper, until it reached Melissa before he ever got the chance to tell her himself, filtered through the shocked expressions of her own relatives before a single word passed between husband and wife. He watched her face change in real time from across the reception hall, the color draining from her cheeks, her jaw tightening in a way he recognized from every hard conversation they had ever avoided having. He had no idea why. In his mind, he had just done the single most generous thing of his entire life, and the woman he loved most in the world was looking at him like he had committed some unforgivable act in front of everyone who mattered to her. Melissa pulled him aside, away from the music and the toasts, out through a side door into the cool night air, where a handful of guests could still see them clearly through the glass, and in front of 40 relatives who watched the whole exchange unfold without hearing a word of it. She said the sentence that would replay in Daniel's mind for months afterward. "You're an embarrassment to this family." Her voice was low, controlled, almost more frightening for how quiet it was, nothing like the shouting he might have braced himself for. She turned and walked back into the reception without another word, leaving Daniel standing alone in the dark near the parking lot, humiliated, confused, and completely unable to understand what he had done wrong. He stood there for a long moment before following her back inside, forcing a smile through the rest of the evening, while every relative in that room seemed to already know something he didn't. Carol would not meet his eyes for the rest of the night, offering him only a stiff, distant nod when he tried to catch her gaze across the dance floor. Daniel and Melissa drove home in near total silence that night, the kind of silence that felt heavier than any argument. He went home that evening not even certain his marriage would survive the week, replaying the sentence over and over, searching every angle of it for a meaning he could understand, and finding none. He didn't sleep. He lay awake beside his wife, who also wasn't sleeping, both of them staring into the same darkness from opposite sides of a gap neither of them yet knew how to name. In the days that followed, Daniel could not stop replaying the moment, searching for the mistake he must have made. Melissa wasn't answering his texts the way she used to, short, clipped replies where there used to be warmth, and Carol's calls to the house grew shorter, colder, more distant, until they nearly stopped altogether. Confused and hurting, and increasingly desperate for some explanation that made sense, Daniel began going through old paperwork, bank statements, mortgage documents, anything he could find, looking for something that might explain what he had missed. What he found stopped him cold. Buried in a folder of old financial documents, Carol's mortgage had been refinanced 18 months earlier, and Melissa's name was already listed on it as a co-signer, long before Daniel had ever heard about any foreclosure notice, long before he even knew there was a problem at all. He sat at the kitchen table with that document in his hands for nearly an hour, reading it over and over, trying to make the dates line up into a story that made sense. Daniel sat with that discovery for a long time before he understood what it meant. Melissa had already been quietly paying down her mother's mortgage for 2 years, using money from an inheritance she had never once mentioned to her husband in 9 years of marriage. She had a plan, a private timeline, a promise she had made to herself that she would pay it off entirely on her own terms, without Daniel or anyone else in the family ever learning where that money had come from or why she had guarded it so carefully. Daniel had not rescued the house. He had walked directly into the middle of a rescue that was already quietly underway, and in doing so, he had erased his wife's role in it without ever knowing she had one at all. Every dollar he had wired had, in effect, overwritten a story Melissa had been writing alone for 2 years, a story built on sacrifice and secrecy that Daniel's grand gesture had accidentally made irrelevant. For a while, the people around Daniel offered him a simpler explanation, the kind of explanation that felt easier to accept than the truth. A close family friend, someone who had known Melissa since childhood, told him that Melissa was simply proud, that she didn't like being outdone, that some people just can't stand it when someone else solves their problems for them, especially in front of family. Daniel wanted to believe that. It would have made the humiliation easier to carry, easier to file away as a misunderstanding between two proud people, rather than something deeper and harder to face. But it wasn't the truth, and somewhere inside himself, Daniel already knew it wasn't enough to explain the look on his wife's face that night, or the way Carol still couldn't quite look at him weeks later. Pride alone doesn't explain a mother's panic on the phone. Pride alone doesn't explain why Melissa had been secretly paying a mortgage for 2 years without a single mention of it to the man she shared a bank account and a life with. The real explanation came from Melissa herself, late one evening in their kitchen nearly a month after the wedding, her voice breaking as she said words out loud that she had never said to anyone, not even her own sister. Her father, the man who had abandoned their family when she was 12 years old and vanished from their lives almost entirely, had died wealthy 2 years earlier, running a successful business 3 states away with a second family Melissa had never met, and still, to this day, had no relationship with. He had left her a substantial inheritance in his will, an amount that had shocked her when the lawyers first contacted her, and that Melissa could only describe as guilt money, a final gesture from a man trying to buy back, in death, something he had thrown away in life. She had never wanted his money. She was ashamed of it, ashamed of what it represented, ashamed that a portion of her comfort now traced back to the very absence that had shaped her entire childhood, and she had been secretly using it to pay off her mother's mortgage, specifically so that Carol would never know where it came from. Carol had suspected for months, longer than Melissa realized. She had noticed the mortgage balance shrinking faster than her own modest payments could explain, and she had spent those months quietly dreading a conversation she wasn't ready to have, turning the question over in her mind every time a new statement arrived in the mail. She did not want her ex-husband's money touching her home in any form, clean or otherwise, and she had been carrying that dread alone, the same way Melissa had been carrying her shame alone, each of them protecting the other from a truth neither one wanted to say out loud at the dinner table. Daniel's payoff, as it turned out, had replaced tainted money with clean money, his own money, earned honestly over years of early mornings and long jobs, and a business built one client at a time. In a strange way, his gesture had actually solved the very problem Carol had been quietly dreading, severing her home from any remaining tie to the man who had abandoned her family decades earlier. But nobody had explained any of this to Daniel, because nobody had ever explained the deeper story to him at all, not in 9 years of marriage, not once. Every person at that wedding reception had been quietly protecting someone else from a painful truth, and Daniel, without meaning to, without any awareness of the ground he was standing on, had walked into the middle of it holding a spotlight, illuminating exactly what everyone had spent years trying to keep in the dark. His generosity had not created the secret, it had simply forced it into the open, all at once, in front of 40 relatives who had no idea what they were witnessing either. The conversation between Daniel and Melissa that followed was not loud. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, only long silences, and an honesty that had been missing from their marriage for years, sitting across the kitchen table from each other until well past midnight, working through a story that had been building since long before Daniel had ever entered Melissa's life. Melissa finally admitted that the word embarrassment had never really been about Daniel at all. It was panic, spoken in front of her family, aimed inward at herself, at a secret she had just watched unravel in real time in front of the people she loved most, at a plan 2 years in the making that had collapsed in a single evening without any warning. Daniel realized, sitting there in the quiet of his own kitchen, that his act of generosity, sincere and well-intentioned, had detonated something that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface of his marriage since before he ever met his wife, something neither of them had ever fully looked at together. What followed was not a simple, tidy ending, the kind you might expect from a story like this one. Daniel and Melissa began attending counseling together, something neither of them had ever seriously considered before that wedding night, sitting in an unfamiliar office once a week, slowly learning how to talk about money, grief, and family in ways they had spent 9 years avoiding. It was slow, and it was uncomfortable, and there were sessions that ended in tears, and sessions that ended in silence, but they kept going back. Carol, for the first time in years, thanked Daniel directly, sitting with him on her porch one Sunday afternoon, months later, telling him plainly that she understood now why he had done what he did, even if she still wished it had happened differently. In her own time, she began to make peace with where the money in her life had truly come from, separating, piece by piece, the years of pain tied to her ex-husband from the home she still loved, and the daughter who had spent 2 years quietly protecting her from a truth she wasn't ready to hear. Melissa took the funds that Daniel's payoff had freed up, money she no longer needed to send toward her mother's mortgage, and quietly set up a savings account in her mother's name instead, a small act that let her reclaim some ownership over a story that had briefly slipped out of her hands in front of 40 relatives at a wedding. It wasn't the grand gesture Daniel had made. It didn't need to be. It was simply hers again. Looking back now, that single sentence, "You're an embarrassment to this family," means something entirely different than it did on the night Daniel first heard it, standing alone outside a barn venue way,